Hey everybody, what's going on? Welcome to Better Than Food Book Reviews. I'm your host, Clifford Lee Sargent, and today I am reviewing White Slave by Marco Pierre White. White Slave was the original title back over in England. Here, I believe it's known as The Devil in the Kitchen. White Slave, I think you'll agree, is way better. Was written by Mr. White himself along with James Steen. As you could guess, it's all about the chef Marco Pierre White, who I'm going to discuss today in great detail. The Mark E. Smith of celebrity chefs. If Anthony Bourdain is the Hunter S. Thompson of chefs, then Marco Pierre White is the Ernest Hemingway. But let's start off with the bigger picture, the bigger question here. What is it about food? It all does come back to food, doesn't it? To be obsessed with food, like so many great chefs are, is to be obsessed with the sensorial experience. Which is to say, it's to be obsessed with life and its limits of experience. Is it any wonder that we all have food issues of some sort? Whether we're trying to eat less or more or healthier or more consciously, whatever. Food is an indicator of identity, of status, even politics for all you militant vegans out there. Sometimes the food you eat makes you think you're a better person. A more ethical person, a happier person. A healthier, fitter, sexier, wiser, or more creative person. More this, more that. Your history is tied up in food. The history of your species is tied up in food. Your social class is represented in the recipes you're most familiar with. You know what the biggest fight starter in relationships is? Honey, where are we going to eat tonight? Single biggest nationwide health epidemic. Not smoking, it's obesity, due to overeating. Because the way many people deal with stress is with food. Food may be the most important thing you deal with day to day. We're trying to eat less of it. Plenty of cultures around the world don't have enough of it. And for this reason, it's unsurprising that it can hold people's interest, with enough strength to develop into a full-born obsession. Maybe sometimes healthy, probably not. Now, working in a restaurant, being the head chef, is a dictatorship. It is not a democracy. Like film. This is why they call them directors. That's why they call them chef, French for chief, or boss. In Marco's own words, I make no apologies for my strict leadership methods, and I have no one to blame but myself. One day a chef moaned that he was too hot, so I did something that, on reflection, was rather hazardous. Carving knife in one hand, I held his jacket with the other and slashed it. Then I slashed his trousers. Both garments were still on his body at the time. That should provide a bit of ventilation, I told him. And when he asked if he could change out of his chopped up clothes, I said yes, at the end of the service. He's been called many things, including insane and crazy, of course, but immediately I want to assure you, this guy is anything but. There's a serious method to the madness, an intentional direction of obsession, unfueled by drugs or booze. Self-destructive assuredly, but diligently focused on achieving the only thing that he decided matters. In this case, it would be achieving the status of 3 Michelin stars. And Marco Pierre White became the youngest to do so at 33, mastering French cuisine without ever having been to France. White slave refers to the idea of being a slave to your dream, to your desires, to your obsession, following it to whatever end may come, limits be damned. This was a man who was responsible for creating the monster known as Gordon Ramsay. Maybe you've seen Hell's Kitchen, filled with Gordon Ramsay abusing wannabe celebrity chefs. My younger brother's personal favorite was when he called somebody an idiot sandwich, literally took 2 slices of bread, slapped them over her ears, faced her directly, and screamed at her, "What are you? An idiot sandwich?" Well, Marco Pierre White is the dude who made that guy curl up on the floor of the kitchen and cry. Surprisingly, that wasn't the straw that broke the camel's back between them. That came later and quietly, almost like tragically, but you can read and figure that out for yourself. Throughout Marco Pierre's journey of this kind of post-punk era England through all these restaurants, you can just hear the Falls Hex Education Hour amidst like the clattering and the screaming and the vents and the hot pans and the profanity and the grease fires and whatever. To get an idea of who this guy is, you ought to watch this Oxford address. To see his demeanor, how he handles himself. You'll notice as soon as he enters and sits down and begins speaking, every single millennial present just shuts the fuck up. And I don't think the moderator even talks for like 20 minutes into it. He has a commanding presence. He utilizes silence. When he opens his mouth, he knows exactly what he's doing. Of course, he can be an asshole. That is often how you get things done. You think I'm joking? Well, imagine, like he does in this book, that you were very polite and took your time with all of your chefs while trying to create perfection in the kitchen. How the hell would it turn out if you were just pussyfooting around all of your staff saying stuff like, "Now Rick, would you please take this out to table so-and-so and thank you ever so much"? No, you say, "Who nicked my cutting knife? And why the fuck are the cheeses wrong?" You see, the story opens with him angrily throwing these cheeses, literally picking them up off of the cart and hurling these cheeses at the wall, like 8 of them, and they all just stick there. And when somebody goes to clean it up, he's like, "No, leave it!" Because he wants the young kids to see. He wants them to get that impression and have that be a visual lesson that will stick with them, like the cheeses, in their head for the rest of their lives. Because when you get to this level, things become extreme, right? Of course they do. You need to be as economical as physically possible, never mind humane. You have to deliver the message that they must never take a shortcut. You can't just say, "Come on boys, let's try to get it right." That just won't work. If you are not extreme, then people will take shortcuts because they don't fear you. And to achieve and retain the very highest standards, day after day, meal after meal, in an environment and as difficult and as fast and chaotic as a restaurant kitchen, is extreme, well, in the extreme. My pursuit for excellence went way beyond a passion for food. I was a man obsessed. I had to be the best, and in order to do that, I would have to win 3 Michelin stars. To explain, the Michelin Guide is the little red book that was first published by André Michelin in 1900 in France, and today is updated every January. To every great chef in Europe, and since 2006 New York City, it is known as the Bible. Its rating can make or break careers, restaurants, even entire towns. 3 stars, the guide's highest rating, means that your place serves exceptional cuisine and is worth a special journey. But that's an amazing understatement. A restaurant with 3 Michelin stars is a monument to the highest, the most extreme expression of the art of cooking. At the time of writing, only 54 restaurants in the whole of Europe have 3 stars. When I won mine, I became the first British chef and the world's youngest ever to achieve such an accolade. That basically sets up the whole story, the whole theme, all the thematic elements perfectly, all in those couple paragraphs. The idea here is that, you make a decision that something is worth going for, and then everything else kind of falls to the wayside, including happiness and contentment. Basically, like, the idea here is that there's more to life than being polite and happy. This is about speed, determination, perfection, which is to say, again, obsession. This is about excess of perfection, pushing the limits of the hero's journey, about the entire movement of human perfectionism distilled into the story of a working-class British chef from Leeds named Marco White, whose addiction to the kitchen turned into a remarkable journey. I suppose I was trying to kill myself, but then sacrificing your health for your career was all the rage. Harvey's opened against the backdrop of Margaret Thatcher's greed culture. People talked about city types being burnt out by the age of 30. Young men and women didn't stop to question the damage that can be caused by chronic obsession. We didn't pause to consider the consequences of the pace. Wall Street was the big movie of the year, and that was a film about greed and self-indulgence, about hunger for success. Its underlying message was that greed is destructive, but the subtext was totally missed by the cinemagoers of my age, which I totally imagine is true. Instead, everyone was reciting Michael Douglas's line, "Breakfast is for wimps," as if it was the mantra for anyone who wanted to get to the top. My own breakfast, by the way, has always consisted of the same 3 courses: a coffee, and a cigarette. In Harvey's, I had found my adrenaline heaven. This was pain paradise. Customers may well have gone there to fill their stomachs, but I went to feed my addiction to work. My addiction to adrenaline and to pain, and at Harvey's, something was always happening. There's actually one point where he's living with some smack addicts somewhere, and he isn't using, but they are. And one of them, who's this like utterly, kind of almost destitute heroin addict, is like, "You're addicted, Marco." The junkie is telling him he's addicted. According to Marco, he doesn't invent things. He refines them. We live in a world of refinement, not in a world of invention. That's the way I see it. People who claim to have invented a great dish are only fooling themselves. Someone has always done it before. Same with this story. He didn't invent it. It's the oldest one there is. But he did refine it, and there's no better way to spend an afternoon than reading about this man's obsession with exceptional food. Maybe you've worked in a kitchen, maybe you haven't. Maybe you remember burning your hand on hot pans and some of the worst smells ever created. Maybe not. If you haven't, you can take my word for it. It's one of the most stressful environments you will ever witness. There's a certain personality that can totally become addicted to it. Me, not so much, but then again, I was just washing dishes back in the day. I ate pretty damn well, though. Marco came from a working-class family in Leeds, England. In his own words, we might not have had much of anything else, but we always had lots of food. Chefing was in his blood. His father did his best after Marco's mother passed away when Marco was like 8 years old, very, very young, extremely tragic. He had several brothers, so, it was just the dad and the boys. Going on about his father, he was a disciplinarian raised on Victorian principles, but he was also a charming eccentric with a superstitious love for gambling, in particular on dogs and horses. And he was also a fierce defender of his boys, sometimes physically. Of Dad's various life-enhancing cautions, he had two that concerned the subject of punch-ups. The first came shortly after my mother's death, when he sat me down to give me some fatherly advice about fighting. "It doesn't matter if they beat you," he said, "as long as you hurt them more than they hurt you, they'll never come back for more." The second piece of advice was simpler. Don't argue. Just hit him. He practiced what he preached. One day I was walking into town with him when we saw two young men taunting a tramp. Dad told me to wait for him while he went up to the two yobs. I thought he was going to tell them to stop teasing the poor homeless vagrant. Instead, he simply punched each man in the face and strolled back to me, and then we continued our walk to the shops, as if nothing untoward had happened. As one of Dad's mates had said of him, Frank was the only man who could start a fight in an empty room. My dad used to say that it was a lot easier back in the day to take care of small problems when you could just punch somebody in the face if they were being an asshole. Might be the truth. So starting at a very young age and leaving school for it, Marco travels from restaurant to restaurant, gaining skills and learning the tricks of the trade, so to speak. The better I was at the job, the better I felt I could cope with my insecurities. I would become first and foremost addicted to the adrenaline of cooking rather than the passion for great food. That comes later. And it's very interesting to see the entire development of this personality, of this character, of this man's life, of his obsession. Again, that word keeps popping up. That's what all this is about anyways. It's the only thing that makes literature great is obsession. This is all about gastronomical obsession mixed with adrenaline addiction. Two things that complement each other quite nicely. Gastronomy begins with technique. If you haven't got technique, you will never master gastronomy. You should buy the best ingredients and cook them perfectly. But to do this, you have to question what you are doing and why you are doing it. If you don't understand what makes a good, say, roast partridge, the hanging, the plucking, the trussing, before you've even started, then don't bother roasting it. You've got to hang the bird correctly, pluck it correctly, without piercing the skin, and truss it beautifully, bring in the legs and plump out the breast so that it cooks evenly, retaining the heart and the livers for sauce. Seal it on all sides and then cook it on the back. What's the timing of it? About 10 minutes in my oven, but your oven is different than mine. A male partridge is bigger than a female partridge. A partridge shot in December is bigger than one shot in September. So the beacon, the summit, right, that Marco is on the trajectory towards, becomes the 3 Michelin stars for his restaurant. To call his journey grueling is a gross understatement. To call it anything less than impressive is incorrect. In the journey, he learns the limits of discipline. The prospect of receiving a loud bollocking, getting screamed at, from either chef forced me to discipline myself. Arrive on time, keep surfaces tidy, absorb the pressure and cook well, but there is a major flaw in severe discipline. It suppresses flair, imagination, and talent. Along the way, you have a whole host of recognizable characters. There's a great passage about the late and great British Hellraiser actor Oliver Reed, star of The Devils, when he becomes a regular in Marco's restaurant. Marco even opens up a restaurant with Michael Caine. Yes, the Italian job you're only supposed to blow the bloody doors off, Caine. Business between them later sours, for reasons that we are not privy to. But Marco runs into him at a party later on with Harvey Weinstein. This is great. Harvey shook my hand and, clearly unaware of the difficulties Michael and I had been through, pointed at Michael and said to me, "This guy here is the toughest guy you'll ever meet." Michael looked at his movie-making friend and said, "Harvey, if you think I'm tough, try dealing with him." And of course, when Marco opens up his own restaurants, he doesn't take any bullshit. He will, quite intentionally, kick out any customer who fucks with him or his staff, which of course makes for great reading and definitely worth the price of the book alone. So the book is composed of many anecdotes, you know, in the linear format of Marco's life, comparable to these that I've given you, all within the tone of White's voice, and you can hear it as you read it. They've done a very good job piecing this together. This is a great autobiography, if you want to call it that. It's a great story. It's a classic story, and it's easy read, very easy read. This was a 2-day read for me. Easy, easy. And yeah, it's better than food. At the end of the day, it's like he says, we're obeying the rules, we're doing what's expected to get these Michelin stars. There's a great documentary here about the Michelin star obsession that features a great interview with Marco Pierre White. He always famously says, and he says in this book, and he keeps repeating himself because this line is very important, at the end of the day, the chefs must accept that the people judging them have less knowledge than they have. The people who are judging them for the Michelin star rating have less knowledge than the person who's actually cooking for them. Which of course is true. Everybody's a critic. Anyways, Marco goes on to describe how the prestige has deteriorated, the prestige of the Michelin guide system has deteriorated since he was a boy. It used to be like winning an Oscar, he says, and now it seems like they just hand them out like candy. Trying to get people to buy their ad and getting cozy with the chefs, everything changes. I think that's like a lot of systems, many of the old systems, most of them. Anyway, you now have a clear picture of me as the boss. I was nasty, vicious, aggressive, and blunt. I put my hands up to all that. But hey, don't get me wrong. Along the way, I had earned the respect and loyalty of the brigade. And away from the kitchen, I like to think I had my moments of compassion too. I didn't want things to be perfect. I didn't want pleasure. I was driven by my insecurities and a fear of failing, and to some extent a fear of dying before achieving my ultimate goal. The kitchen was the only place where I felt comfortable. So of course, did Marco Pierre White get what he wanted? Technically, yes, in the material sense. He got the 3 stars, yeah. Was he satisfied, happy, content, without that desire for anything greater? Without the internal longing that plagues us all to do more, to be more than we are or can even imagine ourselves to be? Of course not. Old story. And he didn't create it. But he did refine it, and quite well. So if you're interested in gastronomy or anything culinary culture, if you like Anthony Bourdain or Gordon Ramsay, it's best to start at the source. And that, in this case, the source of badass chefs can be traced back to Marco Pierre White. Always remember that life is too short to eat or read bullshit, and remember that it'll be shorter, likely, if you do. That's all I got for you today. Thanks for watching. Ciao!